Welcome to Fun and Games Side Quests. Every episode is a different host sharing a video game they love and why they love it.
Hello everyone, my name is James Galizio. I'm a freelance games crit that's been featured at a bunch of different outlets including Games Radar, Upload VR, and my main job is as a senior staff writer at RPG Site. And fittingly, the game I'm going to be talking about today is in fact an RPG, a dungeon RPG, if you will. Dungeon RPGs are a bit of a subgenre in the RPG space that have a much higher focus on party building, party composition, dungeon design, and they're very much a bit more hardcore than most RPGs on the market. So the game I'm going to be talking about today is Labyrinth of Galleria. It's a dungeon RPG that was developed by Nippon Ichi Software and was released in Japan in 2020. The localization came out last year in 2023 in the US and Europe. And the thing that's special about it is that dungeon RPGs as a whole, since they're mechanically dense, usually they don't have a huge focus on the storytelling. And while Labyrinth of Galleria and its prequel, Labyrinth of Refrain, are definitely mechanically dense, in fact, you can have up to 40 different characters in your party, which is absolutely ridiculous compared to some of the other games on the market. The thing that makes these games so special, though, and Galleria especially, is the fact there is a bigger focus on storytelling. In fact, it's the main focus that makes Galleria so special. So think about some of your favorite RPGs and think about some of your maybe favorite visual novels and the stories they tell, and specifically the storytelling, the method in which the story is told. Galleria, what's so special about it is that even though it's a dungeon RPG, many of its story scenes are kind of told in a visual novel format. And because of that, there's a very direct focus on these characters, their lives. There's like dozens of different characters, named characters in Galleria. And the way that the story evolves from the prologue to the middle of the game to the end of the game, it's very fascinating. And in a way, it's also very non-linear. It's kind of hard to talk about specifics without getting into spoilers, but one of the things that really stood out to me when I was playing through Galleria for the first time is that there's all these little bits and pieces as you're going through the game where it kind of just like peppers pieces of info that, taken out of context, they don't mean much, but later on in the story, it clicks and you realize just how much the game's story has been setting itself up throughout the entire runtime. This is a very long game. One thing I will say is that about 30, 40 hours into the game, you swap protagonists, you swap your characters. In fact, your party, you have to completely rebuild with completely different units that have completely different archetypes, even to a certain extent. And the gameplay shifts, but the story shifts too. And you're wondering how this has anything to do with the other half of the game, the first half of the game. And because there's some characters that are the same between these two halves, but you don't really have the context yet to realize what's going on. And then once you get back to a point where things click together, it really gets to a situation where you realize that from the beginning of the game, you're being set up for this. And the story, once it comes together, it's one of the most special stories in gaming. It has a really strong message, and just the way it's told and the conclusion is something that I never would have expected from a dungeon RPG, even considering the fact that even Labyrinth of Refrain, the previous game, had a very strong story. I'm not sure if I would recommend it to everyone as their first dungeon RPG. One thing I will say is that it does feel like Galleria, to a certain extent, does expect you to have a few dungeon RPGs under your belt, particularly Labyrinth of Refrain, because the combat, the party building, everything has been taken up a notch. And it feels like if I didn't have that experience from other games in the subgenre and Refrain, maybe I would have been a bit overwhelmed. But if you've been into RPGs for a long time, I feel like there's a decent chance that you haven't really played a lot of dungeon RPGs because they haven't really been popular in the West outside of games like Etrian Odyssey. And Labyrinth of Galleria is one of those games, one of those dungeon RPGs that came out, and even people that haven't been traditionally fans of dungeon RPGs, people have read and listened to stuff I've said about Galleria and Refrain, and I've played them in the past. And I feel like there's definitely a case to be made that if you want to get into these styles of RPGs, there's definitely worse places that you can start. Like, obviously, if you want to try Etrian Odyssey, everyone loves Etrian Odyssey. Well, anyone that played those anyways. But one of the things I feel like is a massive drawback or like a barrier to getting into dungeon RPGs has always been the fact that they've traditionally been for a traditional sort of player. Like I said, Galleria and Refrain, one of the things that makes them very different from their contemporaries in the genre is the fact that they do have that heavy focus on story. They do have that heavy focus on characters, and that's something that really isn't common in the genre. They'll have stories that are like kind of set dressing, but beyond that, they're like a means to the end. Whereas in these games, and especially Galleria, it is a focus, even if everything else that makes dungeon RPGs so different from their contemporaries and other subgenres of RPGs, even though everything like that is still there, it has that story that maybe someone that hasn't been able to get into dungeon RPGs, to get into blobbers beforehand, maybe if you give these games a shot, it'll open your eyes and maybe it'll open like doors for you to try other dungeon RPGs in the future. But even outside of that, if you're already into the dungeon RPG genre and somehow you haven't given these a shot, there's plenty here for you. Like, even if you're not a big fan of stories in your blobbers or dungeon RPGs, obviously there's still a lot of mechanical complexity here. Like I said, you can have parties with up to 40 different characters, which is massive. One thing that Galleria does that Refrain didn't is that even when you're going through the base game, not even the post game, they expect you to kind of like reincarnate your units. And there's like a fascinating system where you do really have to like consider like your soul level for your units, and the soul level gets higher as you reincarnate max level or higher level units, which kind of increases the rate in which you gain stats for those units. And that sounds like for anyone that isn't into dungeon RPGs, that it might be a bit overwhelming. But ironically enough, because you have these massive parties with up to 40 characters, but only 3 of them on each slot, and there's like 5 slots, is even usable directly in battle, it becomes really easy where you can just swap out the primaries, refresh them, and have them in the back row, and they'll be like accruing experience points as you're doing battles, and you're able to really it's a great gameplay loop. And especially for folks that are already familiar with dungeon RPGs, even if you don't care about the story, which you should, Galleria is just one of those special games. And I feel like it's one of those games that for a specific type of person, and definitely me, it's something special. It's something that's going to stick with you, whether it's the gameplay, whether it's the story, whether it's the soundtrack. Oh God, the soundtrack, the credits theme, the true credit sequence is just something else entirely. But I don't know. I've always loved dungeon RPGs. I've always loved games like this. And I understand that for a lot of people, it's really hard to get into this genre. I really understand that for a lot of people, they don't even know where to start. I hope that for those types of people, Labyrinth of Galleria can be that sort of gateway drug into this subgenre, because I really do feel like, especially if you're already a fan of RPGs, if you are already a fan of stuff like tabletop, that this is a game and this is a genre, a subgenre that you could really get yourself into. And it's really hard to sell it to people that aren't already in the genre. Labyrinth of Galleria is probably one of my favorite games of all time. And I don't say that lightly. I've played so many different RPGs, and there's just something about it that really still sticks with me, even almost like 5 years since I played it when it came out in Japan. But anyways, thanks again for having me. Thanks again, SideQuest, and I hope you guys have a great rest of the holidays. And of course, happy gaming.
Do you feel like you're the only person in your circle who wants to go deep about video games regularly?
We were like that too, until now.
Welcome to Crossplay Conversations, the brand new bi-weekly topical video game podcast from Luke Lewis,
Joseph Hooper,
and Jacob McCoy.
With many years of breaking it down separately on shows like the Left Behind Game Club, Player Podcast, and Lukewarm Games, the gang is finally coming together to publish their gaming group chat in audio form every other week.
Expect roundtable reviews of the latest games, profiles of upcoming indies, and insightful conversations about essential topics in the video game industry. all with a mostly positive, insightful, and fun style.
Crossplay Conversations debuts on August 1st with brand new episodes hitting every other Tuesday. Help us out by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice to get the first episodes delivered straight to your feed.
And follow us on Twitter at Crossplay Convos for updates about the show.
Cheers
and happy gaming.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.